Welcome to this episode of the Disease Du Jour podcast on the topic of equine influenza with Dr. Tom Chambers of the University of Kentucky Gluck Equine Research Center. I'm your host, Kim Brown, publisher of Equi Management. The Disease Du Jour podcast is brought to you in 2022 by Merck Animal Health. Dr. Chambers is a professor at the University of Kentucky's Gluck Equine Research Center, and he focuses on the study of infectious disease, especially equine influenza. Dr. Chambers, who's been at the Gluck Center for 30 years and who studied avian and human influenza for 10 years prior to that, has been in the forefront of equine influenza vaccine research, including that done for Merck's Fluavert IM. Chambers heads the OIE Reference Laboratory for Equine Influenza at the University of Kentucky. Many of the virus strains in current equine influenza vaccines came from Dr. Chambers' laboratory. Dr. Chambers received his bachelor's and his PhD in microbiology from the University of Notre Dame. Welcome to the podcast, Dr. Chambers.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
The EDCC, or the Equine Disease Communication Center, as our vet listeners know, has reported just this year equine influenza cases in Colorado, Florida, Kansas, Maryland, New York, Oregon, Rhode Island, South Carolina, Washington, and Wyoming. And that included the outbreak at the BLM Wild Horse Facility in Colorado, where as of May 17, a total of 144 horses had died since the equine influenza outbreak began on April 23. And that brings to mind, as Dr. Chambers and I were talking, 2018-19 in Europe, they went from like 50 cases of influenza a year to over 4,000, which shut down racing and events and all kinds of things. And then Australia, remember back in 2007, they spent $1 billion, that's with a B, to control an equine influenza outbreak. So herpes virus is on everyone's mind, but equine influenza outbreaks are more common than herpes virus outbreaks. So, Dr. Chambers, how can vets re-engage their clients to mitigate the risk of equine influenza?
Well, Kim, first of all, I'd say you left out flu in Missouri. We just got an isolate from donkeys in Missouri just this week.
Oh, my goodness.
And in an average year, and the Merck respiratory biosurveillance program actually has been collecting this data for many years. Kudos to them for maintaining that program. It's a great program. And there are years when herpes is more common, but typically flu is the more prevalent. It's called, our term is enzootic, which is the animal equivalent of endemic, meaning it's always present at some usually low level in the population. And like in 2021, there were outbreaks in over 30 states. Wow. And we made over 100 virus isolates from a couple hundred samples. And so it is always present. That's not to say that every farm has it all the time. It's a disease that transmits and moves around, and horses move around. And so a horse that was in Florida in February, March might be in Kentucky in April and May, or maybe by now it's in Maryland. The disease is like flu in humans. It can be very severe, like we saw in Colorado, or it could be so innocuous that maybe the horse might think I'm a little off color today, but the owner or trainer or vet might never notice. It has that range of severity from inapparent to potentially lethal. And so there are a multitude of factors that play into that, including the vaccination status of the horse. Now, the Colorado outbreak, the information that the USDA and the BLM have published on that outbreak and I'm in touch with those people also, and their reports say that at the facility there were 2,500 horses, but the particular herd, the West Douglas herd, which was basically wild horses, they were hard to handle. There was a risk of injury if they tried to vaccinate them or to get nasal swabs from them, and so many of those horses had not been vaccinated at all. Some of them had received just a single dose. And a few had received the 2-dose primary course, but the second dose was only, I think, 10 days, 11 days in advance of the outbreak, which is really vaccination in the face of an outbreak, 10, 11 days in advance is like the minimum for it to be effective. In the rest of the facility, there were signs of disease, but no fatalities. And more of those horses had been vaccinated. In the Europe outbreak that you mentioned in 2018, 2019, the horses that had been vaccinated typically showed lower severity of disease than the non-vaccinates. And in Australia was a flu-free country, and so they did not vaccinate their horses at all. So the moral of the story, there's several morals of the story, actually. The moral of the story from Australia is that the virus can transmit. It escaped from a quarantine facility that was designed to keep it inside. It got out anyway. And so it's a tricky virus. The moral from the England outbreak in 2018, 2019 is that the virus changes over time, and flu is also enzootic in England, but they had only had what we call the Florida clade 2s there for over 10 years, and now they had a sudden incursion of the Florida clade 1 strain, and it partially overcame the vaccines. And so the vaccines really have to be kept up to date, and the vaccination status of the horses has to be kept up to date. The moral, I think, the lesson from the Colorado outbreak seems to be, and we're not, the final word has not been written about the Colorado outbreak, and now there's investigators at like 4 or 5 different institutions that are working on it, including my lab, and so the last word has not been written, but it is looking like there were cofactors or secondary factors contributing to the severity of disease in those wild horses. And for example, secondary streptococcal infection seems at this point to have been a major player in exacerbating the severity of disease. So the lesson from that is that vets don't have, well, there are actually anti-flu drugs for use in humans, and some of them do work in horses. But usually by the time the horse is diagnosed with the flu, it's probably too late for the use of those drugs. The secondary infections like Streptococcus are controllable. Again, if you get to them in time, these tend to be very controllable with suitable antibiotic therapy, and vets, I think, are all cognizant of the idea that flu infection, given an antibiotic, it won't touch the flu, but it will ameliorate or prevent secondary infections. So there's possibility of other cofactors too. Smoke inhalation by those horses was suggested, and at this point, the story is unfinished. Nobody really knows at this point what contribution smoke inhalation might have made to the severity of disease in those horses. But whatever contribution it was not for the good, obviously.
Today's Disease Du Jour podcast is sponsored by the Prestige line of influenza vaccines from Merck Animal Health. There's a fine line in influenza protection. Only Prestige contains Florida 13, the most current influenza vaccine strain available. Prestige delivers advanced influenza protection against the most relevant flu strains circulating today. Get the upper hand on influenza with Prestige flu-containing vaccines. Learn more at MerckAnimalHealthUSA.com. And let's maybe take it just another step further, Dr. Chambers. So when we talk about veterinarians trying to re-engage, those are great points that veterinarians can use to point that, all of the things about equine influenza. But when it comes to vaccination and trying to, mitigate the risks through management, what are your tips for veterinarians to work with their horse owners?
I would suggest, first of all, starting a vaccination program, a scheduled series of vaccinations in accordance with the AAEP guidelines. Those guidelines get periodically reviewed, and they are reflect the state of knowledge about the effectiveness of vaccines. So start a program when the horse is a foal. What vaccines need to be scheduled while it's a foal? What vaccines need to be scheduled while it's a weanling? And then stick to that schedule. Second point is what is this horse going to be used for? Is it a performance horse? Is it going to be shipped to a training center? Is it a 2-year-old that's starting to go to performance meets? And what are the risks posed by its being shipped into a different a different surrounding where horses from all over the country might be congregating. And so take that into consideration for your vaccination schedule. Now, as you know from our past discussions, I am not one who thinks that the vaccination, like we sometimes hear recommended with COVID, get a booster every 3 or 4 months. Well, if you're trying to achieve sterile immunity that for COVID, at this point I don't think that's possible, and for flu, I don't think the more you vaccinate, you reach a point where the antibodies you're trying to produce are actually soaked up by the new vaccine, the new dose of vaccine. And so it gets to be so frequent that it's counterproductive. It's not really doing any good. But, there is a happy medium between too often and not often enough. And so I think if you have an at-risk horse, you should strategize the vaccination schedule to try to find that happy medium. And So every 6 months, which is the typical recommendation, that might not be quite often enough. Every 3 months, in my opinion, is too often. And you should, like, talking about COVID vaccinations for myself, I'm getting a booster in the next 2 weeks, and I'm strategizing that so that I'm boosted in advance of some air travel that I'll be taking in June and July.
I did the same thing before I was going to go see my newborn grandson. So
yeah. So that should establish a schedule with a strategy in mind for risk prevention, and then stick to that schedule.
But before you go on, and don't forget your next point you were going to make, but I wanted to touch back on what you had said before. So when veterinarians are planning this, sometimes they may hold off a horse owner to say, no, you're not leaving for that show till the end of July. Let's wait until, the 1st of July instead of, maybe vaccinating in June when you're not traveling. So that's why horse owners need to listen to their vets. And that's why vets need to talk to the horse owners, right, and figure out what is coming up for the horse.
Right, exactly.
Okay.
And I think 1 month in advance of travel or 3 weeks in advance of travel is perfect. 1 week in advance is really cutting it fine. The next point that I wanted to discuss was biosecurity. This is for a traveling horse. That might be difficult because the horse is moving around, but back at the farm, the owner has not just the one horse to worry about, but he's got his entire herd of horses to worry about, and the best way to keep diseases out is quite consciously to take the steps to keep diseases out, which means basically quarantine. It means that new arrivals should not be immediately commingled with the standing horses. It means that there are things that can transmit virus, like it's called Fomite Transmission, which is transmission like on hands. That's why for COVID, we see people avoiding shaking hands and touching the elbows or the knuckles or something, or always washing your hands. Well, think about that for equine flu also. That if you're going from horse A and immediately going to horse B, and you're not really sure that, let's say horse A just came back from wherever, from Colorado or Missouri or Wisconsin, and you should probably keep it in quarantine for 2 weeks to make sure that it is disease-free. And if you're not confident that it's disease-free, then take the steps to prevent fomite transmission from that horse to other horses, like washing your hands. Don't use the same tack or the same feed buckets or the same water buckets, things like that. Possibility of the transport van that horses are moved around in. If you've got a horse that with the snots and mucus collects, even just a spot or two of mucus on the inside of that van, that van ought to be washed with soap and water. Bleach is better, but soap and water usually kills flu. And so, wash out the van before you stick another horse inside that van. So all these things, just be mindful that the various precautions that were advocated to restrict the transmission of COVID. COVID is a lot like flu in several respects. Droplet transmission, for example, So if you have a sick horse, keep it well away from healthy horses. And so I think it's that veterinarians and owners should be mindful of the possibilities, the dangers, the risks that newly arriving horses pose if that until you're confident that the horse hasn't picked up something, from a contaminated van, for example.
Yeah.
That you should be confident about keeping that horse off by itself until you're sure that it's disease free.
That's great points on that. So, okay, so I have to ask, and I don't know if research has ever been done on this, but I remember in my racetrack days, there was arguments about how far a horse's cough or sneeze could spread droplets. So what is a safe distance?
I wish I had a good answer. It's a subject for debate. The literature from the 1960s, when equine flu first began to be studied, was, if I remember right, it was it 10 meters, about 30 feet? And now we think it's at least 50 feet, and it might be 100 feet. And there are questions about wind direction.
Yeah.
This was really rather hotly debated in connection with the Australian outbreak, because there were indications from the epidemiologists who studied that outbreak that it tended to spread in the downwind direction from one premise to the next. If that is the case, then could it spread 1,000 yards and not just 10 yards? Well, I personally am skeptical about that, because there's a big dilution effect. The farther it goes, the more it's going to be diluted, especially if it's on the wind. And it reaches a point where even if you can detect it by PCR, the chances of it being an infectious dose that the horse inhales gets to be very remote, I think. The PCR can detect less than an infectious dose. There's different ways of quantifying virus, and PCR is the most sensitive that we have. It can detect a few a few particles of virus, but it takes more than that to be an infectious dose in a horse by the respiratory route. Yeah. So like I said, it is a hotly debated topic. If you want my advice, I would say maybe 50 feet in the upwind direction and 100 feet in the downwind direction.
Oh, okay.
But there's no guarantees. Yeah. So sorry, but the fact is.
Yeah, and if you're in Wyoming, the people in Nebraska should worry, because the winds are blowing like at 60 miles an hour. So
yeah.
But it'll be dried out before it gets to them. So when we're talking about equine influenza and protecting horses, we've talked about vaccine, we've talked about biosecurity. What else is it that veterinarians need to have top of mind when it comes to discussing equine influenza with their clients?
Well, I think vaccination, biosecurity are the big things. Having a regular monitoring of the horse's health is something that owners ought to do. I mean, a horse can, just like a human can go from today I feel great, tomorrow, oh, what's happened to me? In one day's time, that happens to horses too. And so, just ignoring the horse standing out in the paddock for 2 or 3 days I think is not a recommendation. Instead, you should look at that horse and check its health, and ideally get a temperature on that horse on a daily basis. If you can do it morning and evening, that would be better. That might be a bit of overkill if there's no other risks involved, but at least on a daily basis, have a look at that horse. Any signs of snots, any signs of being off its feed. I mean, there's lots of things besides flu that can go wrong with horses. It's not just the flu, but a lot of these things, if it's a bacterial infection, there's antibiotics that you can give to the horse.
So is there anything else that as veterinarians are trying to re-engage their clients to mitigate the risk of equine influenza that you can suggest to them?
Make sure that the foals get proper passive transfer of colostrum. If they don't, then administer colostrum substitutes or hyperimmune plasma. Foals, a neonatal foal is vulnerable. Colostrum does from a vaccinated mare. A vaccinated dam, colostrum is effective, and in fact, it's effective for probably at least 4 months, and more like 6. And that's the reason why the first flu vaccinations for weanlings are not recommended until like 6 months of age. Actually, in my opinion, they work better at 8 months of age, but that's a long time to wait. So make sure that neonatal foals get proper passive transfer. If the dam is ill, there's a good chance the foal is going to catch it. And like I say, foals are very vulnerable. Neonates are very vulnerable. So that also means keeping a good schedule of vaccinations for the pregnant mare.
Is there anything special or exciting you're working on in your lab right now that you'd like to share with us?
Well, we have a couple projects in progress, and one we're just starting is a project on the microbiome of the juvenile horse. And the microbiome is a term that basically what it means is that the respiratory tract of the horse is the opposite end of the intestinal tract. It's open to the outside, and that means it gets colonized by microbes, bacteria, fungi, viruses from the outside. And the foal can pick these up, by just from its normal investigations of the ground, of its dam, of its surroundings. It is colonizing its intestinal tract with microorganisms that hopefully, like lactobacillus, will be beneficial. And it's also colonizing its respiratory tract. And we know a lot less about the microbiome of the foal and the juvenile horse than we do about adults. I mean, the microbiomes of asthmatic horses have been studied in some detail, but what is a healthy microbiome for the foal, for a 2, 4, 6 month old horse? We don't know that. And so when a horse contracts the flu, one of the things we know happens is that the microbiome changes. And the reason is because flu kills the lining of the epithelial lining of the upper respiratory tract. Those cells just die and slough off. And the effect of that those epithelial cells are actually a defense mechanism because they all have these little hair-like cilia that are beating, and the beating pushes a thin layer of mucus upwards. The mucus is produced in the bronchioles and the trachea, and it's pushed upwards and into the pharynx where it gets swallowed. And generally organisms, fungi or whatever that are trapped in that mucus, once they're swallowed, they're inactivated in the stomach. Okay. And so by always beating upwards, that's a defense mechanism. It helps keep those bugs out of the lower respiratory tract. But flu kills those cells, and so the beating stops, and so you get opportunistic infections like streptococci that could be associated with the mortality in the Colorado outbreak. And there are other opportunistic infections, and these are agents. If you really looked for Streptococcus zooepidemicus in horses, there's a good chance you'll find it, but it doesn't always cause disease because it's kept under control. And with flu infection, that control breaks down. And so that's why these are called opportunist infections. They take advantage of the open gateway, so to speak, into the lower respiratory tract. That changes the microbiome, and we have an idea of what are the bad changes taking place, but we don't really know what the starting point is. We don't really know in a foal or in a weanling, we don't really know what the healthy microbiome looks like. And so that's the point of this research. We're just starting it with foals that are being born this spring. And
wow, that sounds really interesting. I can't wait to see what you discover.
Well, me too. And you know, it's a complex issue because we're using foals on our own farm in central Kentucky, and you know, there's a lot of possibility for variation. I mean, the foals in central Kentucky, do they develop the same respiratory microbiome as foals in central Texas or central Florida, where the environments are different? You know, that's a good question, and it's a complex topic. So it could be years before we actually have good answers to that question.
That's something to look forward to. Well, Dr. Chambers, thank you so much for joining me on this episode of Disease du Jour. And to our listeners, thank you very much for joining us. And a special thanks to our 2022 sponsor, Merck Animal Health. So you can listen to episodes of Disease du Jour on iTunes or SoundCloud or wherever your favorite podcast platform is. Or you can go to equimanagement.com, and we'll have a short article that goes along with each of the podcasts, and you can listen to the podcast directly from the website. And if you've got a question or a suggestion, you can also email me at kbrown, that's the letter K Brown, at equinenetwork.com. So thank you again, Dr. Chambers, and we invite our listeners to make sure and go back and listen to some of our other episodes. Disease du Jour is a production of the Equine Podcast Network, an entity of the Equine Network, LLC.